Hi, in this video I want to talk about Nader, Green, and Seligman's argument in favor of democratizing the corporation. They argue that currently, even though in theory there are many owners, shareholders of a large corporation, they have very little influence over the behavior of the corporation. Now, to some extent, that's a voluntary choice of their own. They could go to shareholder meetings, they could vote their proxies, but they don't tend to do it. It's very rare that any shareholder appears at a meeting. Even with hundreds of thousands of shareholders, companies routinely get only a few dozen at their meetings. Moreover, those people generally just vote the way management wants them to. People get mailed proxy statements, they simply check the management preferred options, they send it back if they send it back at all, and so management more or less gets to do what it wants. It's very rare that anyone even challenges the decisions of management, let alone challenges them successfully. So whatever you might think of the current democratic procedures within corporations, the point is they don't seem to work very well. Moreover, I don't think it's easy to change this, because the fact is that for most shareholders, the odds of affecting this and having whatever changes in the corporation affect your shares and affect your bottom line significantly to make it worth going to the meeting, researching the issues, figuring out who's really the best candidate for the board of directors and so on. It's not worth your time. It's too great an investment of effort, of time, of attention to really make it worthwhile unless you're an extremely large shareholder. And so the fact is most make the rational calculation that it's not worth it, and so they don't get involved. Consequently, there really is very little check on the power of management. Well, you might say, but wait, the CEO, other top managers, they have to report to the board of directors. The board of directors is the group of people who watch the people at the top. And so there is something like a board of internal affairs, somebody who's paying attention to top management, making sure they're doing what they're supposed to do. Well, yes, in theory, that's right. The board of directors does have that authority. They can keep an eye on what the managers are up to, and ideally make sure that the managers really are behaving in the interests of the organization and the interests of society at large. But do they do it? William Douglas, the Supreme Court Justice, ended up saying, actually, they don't. Directors do not direct. Peter Drucker, famous management consulting expert, agrees that boards simply do not function. And so the fact is they don't tend to work out. Now, why? Well, I think it happens at lots of levels in lots of kinds of organizations. It's not only a problem in for-profit companies, it's a problem in non-profit organizations, it's a problem in colleges and universities, and the same thing is true of other kinds of organizations, whether they're in government or non-profit worlds, or whether they are profit-making corporations. Boards of directors just generally don't direct. They don't do much. So suppose, for example, we want to make sure that our company pays attention to the natural environment, that it takes care of the trees, that it takes care of the air, the water, the other things that make the community a valuable place to live and make it possible for human life to thrive. Well, we're going to want the company to be focused on those goals, those stakeholders, which is really everybody involved in that community, as well as the particular owners or shareholders. But how do we do that? How can we structure things in such a way that that's accomplished? And when we think about a board of directors, naturally, in a certain sense, yes, we have to trust the directors to do this, but how do we set things up to encourage that? First of all, it's to act as an internal auditor. The board should be paying close attention to the operations of the company. It needs to attend to what's happening and not simply rubber stamp management decisions, but instead play a kind of role that's almost an adversarial role. Now, not exactly, not like an opposing counsel, but nevertheless, somebody who is paying attention like an auditor, checking the math, checking the decision making, making sure that the process and the substance of the decisions made at the top are reasonable. Secondly, they should be monitoring legal compliance. They should make sure that the company is obeying all laws that apply not only to the corporate structure itself, but to the natural environment, to all sorts of other things that involve social goods. They should make sure that there are no negative externalities that are actually violating the law. Third, they should approve or veto all really important management decisions. Of course, not all sorts of details, not at a very low level, should we replace that copier, if so, from whom, and so forth. But the key decisions that are being made at the top of the corporate ladder, those are the ones they should be approving or disapproving. It shouldn't be simply a question of after the fact coming along saying, well, how they doing? But instead saying, is that a reasonable decision? Do we give our approval for that particular decision? So they should be much more involved hands-on than boards of directors generally are. Fourth, this is something that boards of directors standardly do: hire, fire, and in general replace then a CEO. That is something that all boards have as part of their jobs in general. However, the fact is that it's rarely carried out in practice. Although in theory that's what they do, usually in most companies and in most industries, it's the person who's the current CEO who really plays the largest role in picking his or her own successor. Well, they argue that has to stop. We have to have an independent voice. This should not be viewed as a hereditary monarchy in effect. We should instead have another sort of group look for the good of society as well as the good of the organization in selecting the next leader. Finally, the job of the board is to report to the public. Notice, not just report to the shareholders or the owners, but to report to the public at large. The shareholders, yes, should receive this information from the board, but the board should be making that information public about how the company is doing it, how it's doing it. Now, there are two things specifically that Nader, Green, and Seligman think this entails. The first is that when there are major decisions that involve the health of the community at large, and especially relocation decisions, decisions about closing down a factory, opening up a new factory, and so on, that's something that ought to require community input and community approval. There's a real danger here. It might be that the community is never going to approve a factory closing down in that community. It might be very difficult to open up a new factory if everybody in the community gets a chance to vote on it. Nevertheless, they argue that's something that's important. It does affect everybody involved in those communities. They should have a say. If we're taking stakeholder theory seriously, then anybody affected by the action, and especially those affected significantly as people in those communities are, should have a right to become parties to the contract. And that means that they have to approve changes. So big changes like that need to be approved by the stakeholders, including everybody in those communities. The other major point is that this degree of involvement is not something you can accomplish by just going to a meeting and being there for a day or a part of a day once a month. This is something that requires professional directors. At least some people on the board of directors are going to have that as their full-time job. Now, that's not common practice today. In fact, many directors serve on 2 or 3 different boards. That's got to stop. The argument is maybe a few people like that is fine, but we need enough people on boards of directors who are involved day to day with operations to exert meaningful feedback, meaningful approval or disapproval of actions, meaningful auditing, really, of what the corporation is doing. Somebody looking at things after the fact, once a month at most, on the basis of information given to them by management, that's not enough to exert a real oversight role. Who should serve on the board? There are various proposals for democratizing. Some argue that the customers, the employees, the public at large deserve seats or representation on the board. Actually, Nader, Green, and Seligman don't think that's a great idea for the various reasons we've already talked about in connection with participatory models. They don't think it's a great idea to have government appointing people to the board. After all, now you've got just a different set of special interest groups that might be involved. All of these people, as serving a particular constituency, are going to represent the interests of that constituency instead of the interests of the organization and worrying about the health of the organization. So they think those models are actually not very good. What they do recommend is that people on the board of directors have a specific area of expertise. One might, for example, be in charge of representing environmental considerations. One might be in charge of finance. One might be in charge of personnel-related issues and employee relations. One might oversee other aspects of the company, say marketing or accounting or other specific functions. That way, they have specific roles to fulfill, and they together can do a much more effective job than if each director has the responsibility for overseeing everything. After all, if a director's job is to oversee the entire company, there's a huge amount going on in a large corporation. Very hard to do that, except at a very superficial level. But somebody who's focused specifically on marketing efforts, or somebody who's focusing on environmental concerns, they can devote much more of their attention to something specific and do a much more effective job of oversight. There are 2 other recommendations that they make about a board of directors. The first is that we need at least a significant number of independent directors. All too often, company directors come from either within the company, or from people who used to be with the company and are now retired, or people who are suppliers to the company or in other ways work with the company. They say no. A significant number, at least, and maybe all of the directors really need to be independent. There has already been a significant move in this direction. 84% of all directors in US corporations are independent directors in this sense. And so this is a place where their argument actually has carried a great deal of force and largely been put into practice. It used to be commonplace for a majority of directors to really be, in some sense, internal. Now, only about 1 in 6 is internal, 5 out of 6 are external. And so most companies have indeed adopted this model already. The final point is that there should be term limits for directors. People should be in position for a while, but then they should move on. Otherwise, they develop too close a relationship with management, too close a relationship with the company, and can no longer be counted on to give independent oversight. Well, those are all proposals for ways of trying to democratize the corporation, change the management structure to preserve a board of directors, indeed an independent board of directors with real expertise in the area, but on the other hand, focus people on particular areas of the company, making their oversight more effective and preventing there from being a kind of symbiotic relationship between management and directors that keeps them from doing an effective job.